Thanks for clicking on this video. My name is Lynn Horan, and I am a women-centered leadership and life coach and also former Presbyterian clergy. And my research is specifically focused on the psychological safety and interpersonal boundaries of empathetic and caregiving women leaders. My dissertation specifically focused on clergy women who were in the process of leaving active ministry or had already left active ministry due to violations of their interpersonal boundaries and threats to their psychological safety. And this video is just a brief summary of the dissertation. The link below and details below will bring you straight to the dissertation that you can download and to read in full. I emphasize typically for people to take a look at chapters 4 and 5, which are the research findings, and then my analysis of the findings and the theoretical propositions that came out of this research. So the title of my dissertation was Feminized, Servanthood, Gendered Scapegoating, and the Disappearance of Gen X and Millennial Protestant Clergy Women. So this looks at denominations that have an established history of women's ordination, typically understood as more progressive or moderately to progressive Protestant denominations, where you may feel surprised that there is sort of these still ingrained gender narratives that really prevent clergy women from being fully accepted and embraced in their leadership positions. And as younger generations of clergy women, including myself, I'm a millennial. At the time of this recording, I'm 41 years old, entered the ministry as a second career at the age of 30, and had strictly solo pastor, senior pastor, head of staff roles. So as denominations are seeing younger clergy women coming into these higher level positions, there's a real conflict between gender identity narratives with older congregants and older sort of previous structures of how authority is understood, and organizations are structured that really place clergy women in a very precarious position in which those conflicting gender narratives are often taken out, that conflict is taken out on the clergy women themselves. So I'll give a very brief overview here, hoping not to have more than a 5-minute video here, and then really encourage people to look more deeply into the research and to contact me further. I'm available for presentations, also individual one-on-one coaching, and also recovery from these experiences for those clergy who are currently experiencing them or are kind of safely removed from these really conflictual and toxic congregational settings. So as the title to the dissertation sort of alludes to, there is a discussion within this research on feminized servanthood as dehumanizing and abusive. So feminized servanthood is the understanding of in the context of faith-based leadership, servant leadership, which is sort of an inherent part of faith-based communities, this idea of serving above and beyond yourself for the benefit of others. But there's a feminized element to that in which women are further expected to give of themselves and sacrifice of themselves in ways that are extremely unhealthy and also really prevent a lot of psychological harm. And so women going into the ministry in my generation who are very self-differentiated and understanding boundaries and how to care for oneself and have limitations around their working hours or their ability to be everything and for everyone, there's a lot of pushback against that with again, older understandings. These are older generations, baby boomer and above, who really see women as needing to go even further in that sense of self-sacrifice, which really creates unhealthy and porous boundaries and behavior in congregational settings. So feminized servanthood as dehumanizing, and also feminized servanthood as abusive. So there's two real levels to this that were seen in the research, where in addition to feeling like you really didn't have the freedom to say no to things or place a boundary, that in addition to that feeling of being dehumanized, there was a feeling of psychological abuse, which was ongoing chronic exposure to whether it be bullying or targeting or denial of elements of one's contract, whether it be fair pay or the allotted time off, or pushback in particular for women of reproductive age to appropriate maternity leave policies. So this idea that the woman could not be really herself in this space and was targeted for advocating for herself. So in addition to those two sort of what I would call primary categories of feminized servanthood as dehumanizing and feminized servanthood as abusive, there were several other categories which really communicated the conflict that comes up when we have more self-differentiated younger clergy women serving congregations that have much more ingrained sexism and narratives of masculinity and narratives of what it means to be a woman that are really in conflict with that. So there's a really strong category called, which I titled Differentiating Self from System, Exposing and Protecting Toxic Leaders and Harmful Systems, the process of becoming the target, which is a really strong element of this research that was revealed, and then ultimately reconstituting self after having left that toxic ministry setting. And so following the findings, which again are much more in depth in the actual dissertation, I won't go into detail here, or perhaps may do some follow-up videos on those. The final chapter, chapter 5, is the discussion and analysis of the findings, and then my understanding of the theory that is drawn out of these observations. And so the theoretical propositions that I put forth are, first, the shadow side of servant leadership in the context of feminized servanthood. This shows the real negative impact of gendered understandings of servant leadership that severely compromise the well-being and psychological safety of women leaders. So this typically happens in caregiving professions, whether it be education or healthcare or ministry, where there's this additional layer of expectation of servanthood that's placed on women in addition to the already existing servant leadership models that can be extremely harmful. The next theory that was drawn from this research was reclaiming Gen X and millennial women's leadership strengths and embodied leadership practices. So the women that were ultimately pushed out of their ministry settings or scapegoated out of their congregations really had very, very strong and positive leadership traits. They focused on decentralizing leadership, of bringing people to the table, of expanding voices in discussions and consensus building leadership, which really threatened the status quo of more single narrative or top-down authoritative approaches. And both men and women pushed up against these more expansive and integrative leadership approaches that the women promoted. The third theory that was drawn from this is perceptions. Others' perceptions of these clergy women, these self-differentiated women leaders, as a dissident daughter and an emasculating disruptor. So really the two identities that were most threatened by the self-differentiated women clergy in this study were older women with internalized sexism who really resented the autonomy that the women clergy and their congregations had. And it really caused them to bristle and eventually, in some cases, really gang up on the clergywoman. And I discussed this in the context of what is known as the mother-daughter wound, when women of different generations compete over who gets to be heard based on historical experiences of being denied agency, choice, and voice. And so younger clergywomen coming in with more agency really threatens older women who may not have had that kind of freedom and choice and autonomy. And then the other side of this, the other profile of individuals that feel threatened by self-differentiated women leaders are emasculated men or insecure men who have a distorted sense of masculinity that requires feminine or female servitude. And so if you have a self-differentiated, autonomous, younger woman leader, that destabilizes narratives of masculinity that are based on that sexist model of masculine authority and control. And so when you have those two identities sort of colluding together against a female clergy, it's almost a direct line to a bullying, targeting, and scapegoating dynamic where the woman clergy really has no recourse. When you have maybe a handful, 3, 4, 5 disaffected congregants or denominational leaders in these two profiles of people who feel threatened by that clergywoman, she really has no safe space to advocate for herself and is ultimately pushed out or derailed or sabotaged in her ministry. The next theory that is drawn from this is gendered scapegoating and the disappearance of Gen X and millennial clergy women. So that directly comes out of these two profiles sort of colluding together and pushing a clergywoman out of the ministry and developing a narrative, discrediting her leadership and validating her leadership through a very targeted scapegoating mechanism. A lot of my understanding of scapegoating comes from the French anthropologist René Girard. So a lot of the content in this theory in chapter 5 brings a lot of that in, and as well as human needs theory, the ways in which we look to others to fulfill our understandings of our human needs. And when people don't satisfy that for us, we become aggressive and in some cases violent in trying to satisfy those needs. And when individuals have a need for younger women to be subservient and silent and complacent, then that human need is not met, and aggression is the result in pushing that clergywoman out of her leadership context. And the last theory that I drew out of this was from the sharing of clergywomen that I interviewed in terms of their recovery process, which I've called reconstituting self beyond reckoning and resilience. So I feel very strongly about not promoting a victim mentality in this research, but also acknowledging the victimization that did in fact take place. So I'm not looking at resilience, and nor did the women participants talk about their resilience as a means of oh, this was just a really difficult moment in my ministry and I'm ultimately better for it and stronger for it. That is not the case. This treatment and dehumanization and abuse should not happen and should not continue to happen. So I'm very clear in this section of my dissertation that there is a systemic injustice happening here. At the same time, the women who have experienced it are very much moving forward in a way that is reconstituting self while at the same time acknowledging the harm that has been done. There's also, I sort of interrogate the understanding of reckoning. This research isn't meant to sort of put everything out there and to solve the problems of either, Protestantism in America or these issues in other non-religious settings. That's really up to each of the individual women themselves, to the extent to which they want to put energy and their life force into fixing or improving or bringing more equity into these organizations. My hope is that this research does in fact do that, but that's not an expectation that I have on the women participants in this study, nor do they have that expectation on themselves. They're really working to develop a reconstituted sense of self, a healed self after having gone through religious trauma and church-based trauma and scapegoating. So I offer that as just an introduction to this research. There is a lot of content in the dissertation itself that's worth reviewing if this is something that is of interest to you. And I'd like to close by just saying my primary audience for this are women clergy who themselves are experiencing this kind of abuse and dehumanization. Or those who have left these contexts are in the process of reconstituting, that you do not feel alone, that you feel that there are those of us out there who can listen to you and validate your experience. I hope this research does that as well. I am also now a women-centered leadership coach focused on crisis recovery and healing for women clergy who have been scapegoated by their congregations. So if that's meaningful to you, my information is below in the description of this video, as well as interested members of denominations and faith communities who really have a vested interest in addressing these issues and are willing to do so in a very concrete way. I'd be happy to journey with you as you look toward creating spaces that promote the psychological well-being not only of the congregation itself, but especially the pastoral leaders that you look to. So thank you for watching, and feel free to learn more by looking at the information in the discussion section below.